Final Fantasy XV released November 29th, 2016, meaning that this year the game turns a decade old. Not just that, but Versus XIII, the original inception of 15, was first announced in June of 2006, marking a total of 20 years since the project was first unveiled. For a lot of people, this game is considered to be Square Enix's biggest fumble due to not being the intended Versus XIII vision from Tetsuya Nomura that the game had originally advertised, taking on a drastically different approach once Hajime Tabata took over as director. Now, it's unfair to point fingers exclusively at Tabata for receiving such a different version of this game, given that he took on the role at the end of 2013 due to a restructuring at Square Enix. As amazing as Versus XIII looked, the game was in serious development hell, struggling to make any substantial progress, and by 2013, 7 years since development had begun, the game was still nowhere near close to being finished. Whether it was the engine issues with Crystal tools at the time, team members being pulled to work on Final Fantasy XIII, or the switch to Luminos engine, this game faced numerous development issues. So Tabata ended up walking into a half-baked mess, and while liberties were taken, for better or for worse, he managed to get the game over the finish line, though albeit only slightly resembling Nomura's original vision in parts. Even still though, while Final Fantasy XV is most definitely not without its issues, I love this game's scars and all. It was the first time a mainline Final Fantasy would switch up its genre from a turn-based RPG to a true action RPG, and while that most certainly didn't satisfy hardcore fans, for me, I was completely ecstatic to see what a real-time, action-orientated Final Fantasy would look like. And also being such a huge Kingdom Hearts fan, knowing that the original Kingdom Hearts team responsible for KH1 and 2 were the folks who were initially working on Versus XIII, hence its early gameplay resembling something of a Kingdom Hearts combat system, I paid close attention to Versus throughout the years, excited to one day receive it. Of course, the reminiscent KH command menu coded combat system was changed as development progressed, but its action RPG roots still remained. Kind of. We'll get to that. It's been a number of years since I last played through 15, and I thought it was time to re-experience one of video games' greatest road trips of all time, to see if it still holds up almost 10 years after its release, and to see if I still feel the same way about it. Is this game a masterpiece or a mistake? Well, let's talk about that. 15 revolves around Noctis and his boy band squad, departing to Altissia to seal the deal with childhood friend Lunafreya, acting as a peace treaty between the countries of Lucis and Niflheim, two politically opposed countries who haven't been on the best terms for many years now. This begins the game with a road trip where we must drive across the countryside of Lucis to catch a boat to Altissia in order to get that wifey, but things quickly turn upside down when the Niflheim Empire decide to attack the Lucis capital, Insomnia, killing Daddy Regis and stealing the crystal, which is basically the world's heart that, contains the light and all that. Nothing too crazy. Once Noctis and the gang find out about this, his task then changes to preparing himself to take the throne, journeying across Lucis once again to retrieve a bunch of rusty old weapons and convince a group of gods that you're the right man for the job. Though we still can't forget to get married. That's definitely a priority here for reasons greater than just a peace treaty at this point, as they kind of that one up. This throws the gang into a massive spanning road trip full of camping, chicken riding, food, glorious food, habitat regulation, fishing, and the feeding of cats, all while trying to thwart Niflheim forces where we can. I think 15's story starts off pretty good, though the fact that Square Enix decided to rip an entire context chunk out of the beginning of the game, only to turn it into a CGI movie, as stunning as this all is visually, is still a bizarre choice to me. Kingsglaive is an almost 2-hour movie that takes place right at the beginning of 15, just after Noctis departs from Insomnia. It focuses more on King Regis and his elite group of guards, the Kingsglaive, along with the approaching invasion of Niflheim on Insomnia City, providing context on the Empire and why Regis decided to send Noctis away. I wouldn't say that this movie is absolutely necessary, but it does further build onto the story that 15 is trying to tell, and helps explain the exposition of the game's beginnings. While it's praised for its visuals, the narrative of Kingsglaive wasn't exactly that well received, as it feels disjointed and a bit muddled due to being one part of a larger story found in a video game. Honestly, Square should have just made this a prologue of sorts to 15 itself to help better flesh out the beginning section. That being said, chapters 1 through to 9 out of the 14 or 15 total are actually pretty enjoyable from a narrative point of view, exploring and adventuring across the regions of Lade, Duskai, and Klein, meeting up with Gladio's sister Iris, doing tasks for Cindy, teaming up with Aranea to go dungeon trekking, uncovering tombs for weapons, arriving at one of my most favorite Final Fantasy locations of all time, Altissia, and fighting gods to harness their powers. The way the story is paced, alongside the general flow of how 15's open world is approached, is done really well for more than half of the game. Then you get to chapter 10, where we're suddenly thrown into a linear path of nothing really much. Noctis arriving into the continent of the Niflheim Empire means that from here until the end of the game, the open world section of 15 completely ends and bland linear chapters begin. For most people, this is where 15 falls apart, not just from a narrative point of view, but from a gameplay POV as well. Lots of walking sections and a massive slowdown in pacing, especially if we're looking at the dreaded chapter 13. People were actually very vocal about how bad this chapter was, that Square Enix applied an update that buffed the Ring of the Lucii, as it's the only weapon you can use for a large portion of this chapter, making it so that the ring isn't as frustrating to use by buffing up its attack speed and damage, along with buffing Noctis's jog speed, as that's what you're doing for about 80% of the entire time. They also added a completely new optional path, Chapter 13 Verse 2, where you get to experience the chapter from Gladio and Ignis's POV, which offered a much more enjoyable take on this chapter, with less walking sections. Admittedly though, I don't think chapters 10 to 14 are as bad as people make out. I enjoyed the dynamic change between Gladio and Noctis due to the fight that ensued prior in Altissia. The revelation of Prompto's origin was incredibly heartbreaking, and even furthermore if you played his DLC, but the moment where the group accept him, no matter what, is one of my favorite moments in the entire game, along with diving deeper into Arden's true nature, the Bahamut reveal, and what Noctis must do in order to eradicate the encroaching, everlasting darkness. Even the ending, Final Fantasy XV gorilla slaps me right in the dick of emotions. I haven't sobbed over too many video games in my time, but I'll tell ya, 15 here is one of them. This game unleashed my big boy tears. Noctis returning after spending 10 years within the crystal, fully prepared to make the ultimate transaction to sacrifice himself so that the endless nights stop and the demons are banished, hits hard, especially that final camp scene where Noctis thanks his friends for standing by his side. And with how well this scene was both written and performed, holy hell. And then you also, like, in this moment, remember that the game starts off with a beautiful cover of Stand By Me by Florence and the Machine, and it aligns up with like the whole general theme of the friendship and the road trip and the ultimate conclusion, and it's just like, this is pulling my heartstrings, god fucking damn it! You just went on what feels like a months-long trip with your best friends, creating 45,000 core memories along the way, becoming so damn attached to each of these characters, only to have this as one of the final scenes, bro! In the end, Noctis fulfills his duty and arrives in a kingdom on the other side to finally be reunited with Luna. It's a bittersweet ending for sure, but one that, for me personally, was mostly satisfying. I also really loved the detail of how Luna and Noctis become the Final Fantasy XV logo, along with the nighttime title screen changing to that of daytime to represent that the light has been brought back. Such neat attention to detail. But the last quarter of 15 feels so rushed, where it becomes obvious that the team just slapped the final chapters together with PVA glue and spit in comparison to the first 9. I really wish that chapters 10 through to 13 were proper open world sections, allowing you to explore more of Niflheim and Tenebrae's continent. In fact, the original vision of Versus XIII was supposed to feature a much larger world of Eos, with many areas being cut out. It's thought that Square Enix set a very strict deadline for a 2016 release, meaning that Tabata's new direction development could ensue for no longer than 3 years. This is why the game was originally going to receive a total of 7 DLC episodes, so that it could further expand on parts of the story and characters to help fill in some of the gaps, but unfortunately, the last 3 were ultimately cancelled. If the team had another year to develop the game, I'm sure chapters 10 through to 13 wouldn't have felt so jarring and underwhelming compared to the first half of the game. Other issues that are commonly brought up is underdeveloped character stories, for example Luna, Ravis, and Aranea, a lack of Niflheim Empire focus, even though they're supposed to be one of the main threats of the game, a shift away from the heavy crystal theme that Versus XIII was supposed to have more of, given that this game is a part of the Fabula Nova Crystallis series, only receiving Insomnia leftovers with minimal exploration and 0 daytime sequences. Ramuh, Shiva, and Ifrit segments were so minuscule compared to Leviathan and Titan, and of course, the very underwhelming final fight against Arden. So yeah, flying through Insomnia while the fight ensues, while both Noctis and Arden are using Armature Unleashed is like cool as hell. Like this is fucking sick. But this is also just so nothing burger at the same time, like acting as the final clash at the game, especially when we've just come from the Leviathan fight, which is way cooler hours beforehand. The is this? There are issues for sure, and ones that are often hard to ignore, but if you can manage to look past them, not dwelling too much on what could have been, I think that Final Fantasy XV is actually pretty great. This game somehow manages to capture the essence of a road trip with the bros so perfectly, feeling like the experience has lasted for months, whereas it's only been 20 to 40 hours. The banter between the guys, whether it's traveling on foot, in the car, or on the back of a chocobo, talking amongst themselves or commenting on something is almost always enjoyable. By the end of the game, you feel like you've known these characters for your whole life, and you're a part of the group. This game really does a good job of making you actually care about these characters, hence why that final camp scene is just so devastating. Now, this was the first time that Square Enix developed an open-world Final Fantasy, and as a first attempt, it's not too bad. Certainly not a shining example of an open-world template done right, but good enough for what the game is trying to go for.
The road trip experience.
It's not like this world is littered with distractions, activities, and interesting locations like you'd find in more modern open world games, or even in Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. Square certainly learned a lot from Final Fantasy XV's approach and how to make bigger spaces more interesting, as 15's world is just a tad bland. Now, the bulk of content here is really just side quests. Like, there's a lot of side quests that are usually just collect this or kill that, though there are some interesting ones, like how I had to catch a fish for a cat. I really enjoyed that one. It's for a good cause and all. Or Gladio's side quest, where we have to find ingredients to make the ultimate cup noodle.
The ultimate flavor experience.
This is what we call a flick in the nipple of product placement, but to be fair, I didn't mind this. I just find it hilarious that Cup Noodle canonically exists within the universe of Final Fantasy XV. There's treasure locations that are just randomly found across the map. A lot of these are straight garbage, but some of them are worth picking up, and sometimes you might find a decent weapon or even an accessory. There's also produce spots to harvest ingredients for cooking.
This might be a good spot to find something.
A pretty decent fishing minigame with a ton of different fishing spots around the open world, with a bunch of fish to catch that can either be cooked or sold for gil. You know what they say, a video game isn't good unless it's got a kick-ass fishing minigame, and I can confirm this is one of them. There's bounty hunts, and quite a few of these, that can be accepted at every diner around the map with its own rank system. The higher rank you are, the stronger the monsters you get to hunt, which in return gets you tons of gil and items. There's also this minigame known as Justice Monsters 5, which is an arcade machine that can be found in most diners around the world. It's an interesting amalgamation of a block breaker meets pinball with some light RPG elements. It's actually incredibly addicting. You can actually spend a decent amount of time just standing in the diner, rotting over this arcade machine. This did actually get a standalone iOS and Android version, but was discontinued in 2018, I believe. And lastly, there's the dungeons, and almost all of them are actually pretty good, all being unique and distinct from one another, where some of the best items in the game can be found, and some of the hardest enemies. Though we don't like to talk about the Pitos dungeon, though. Like, this is very much a cursed subject. For whatever reason, Square Enix were like, even though this game is not a platformer, what if we created a dungeon that is primarily focused on platforming? That's a pretty good idea, huh? What are you, mad in the head? This is not Crash fucking Bandicoot! Sure, there's a decent amount of content here where 100% completion can easily net you about 80 to 100 hours playtime, but the thing is, after a while it all kind of starts to feel a little bit stale. It's obvious to me at least that there would have been more interesting stuff within this open world and things to do if the team just had a little bit more time. But it's how you navigate this world though that draws me in. You'll mainly use the Regalia, either manually driving as Noctis or getting Ignis to drive for you in order to get from point A to point B, then travel on foot for a bit, hunt some monsters, do some quests, and by the time you've wrapped all that up, it's probably nighttime, as there is a day and night cycle. So it's probably a good idea to find somewhere to sleep, as during night strong demon creatures spawn, and it also makes traveling by car a pain, as you'll constantly be pulling over due to a fucking giant waking up on the road. This is where you'll either choose to pay for accommodation or camp at a haven. Staying at a hotel or caravan means that you don't get to cook, missing out on some insanely good stat boosts for the next day, but it does provide an XP multiplier for all acquired XP from that day. 15's leveling is unique in that it's not actually applied until you rest, which forces the player to sleep if they want to level up. Now with camping, you'll miss out on that XP multiplier, but Ignis will be able to whip up some of the most delicious video game food you've ever seen. I remember when 15 came out, people were losing their minds over just how incredibly good the food models of this game look. It's funny looking back at these, as they still look pretty great, but probably not as good as what they're serving up in something like Monster Hunter Wilds. Food's kind of one of the central themes here though, as some dishes provide ridiculously good buffs. Although I have to question why a crispy cheese pizza provides unlimited stamina, because I know for a fucking fact that doesn't happen in real life. Or so you gonna charge me 300,000 gil for some caviar canapes? When you come across a new ingredient or purchase a recipe list from a vendor, Ignis will make sure to let you know he's Gordon Ramsay studied the shit out of how to prepare something new.
That's it. That's it. That's it. That's it. What's up, Iggy?
What's what?
I've come up with a new recipe.
The structure is so immersive though. You start your day off fully fed and buffed up, plan your trip, whether it's adventuring out some side quests, making a pit stop to a town to stock up on items. By the way, fun fact, did you know all shops around the world of EOS accept American Express credit cards? Just wanted to point this one out. Maybe you'll fill up the gas tank or grab a bite to eat, hire a chocobo to make quicker progress off-road, then ending the day by choosing where you'll park up to camp, cook some food, and look through the photos that Pronto snapped of the day. It's one in a small handful of RPGs that has truly made me feel like I'm going on this big epic journey, even though ironically it's not a high fantasy game. Square Enix simply nailed the whole road trip aspect of this game to a fine tee. However, this game's combat system is where things get questionable. When you first boot up Final Fantasy XV, you'll see it says, "A Final Fantasy for fans and first-timers," which was also the slogan Square Enix used to promote the game during its marketing phase, so that it would appeal to more people outside of the hardcore fanbase. Technically, you could say that any Final Fantasy is a good starting point for a first-timer, as every mainline game is self-contained. So the slogan is in relation to the game's new combat system. With it now being action, it can appeal to more people, as before 15, every Final Fantasy had been turn-based, with Final Fantasy XII being the most real-time and active so far. For some people, this completely turned them off, and even now there's desperate cries to bring the mainline games back to their turn-based roots, especially with the major success of games like Persona, Metaphor, and Expedition 33 in recent years. The thing is though, Versus XIII was always envisioned as an action RPG, so at least for me, I'm happy that Tabata decided wanted to keep the game as one with his new direction. But that being said, the combat system that we ended up with is, yeah, okay, so like not completely awful, but honestly not good either. Like weirdly, even though I really enjoy 15, this is probably one of the most bland combat systems I have ever played in an action RPG. Attacking is performed by holding down the circle button, and dodging along with guarding is performed by simply holding down the square button. And yeah, that's kind of it. You can switch between 4 weapons. There's a bunch of different types like swords, daggers, spears, guns, and shields, all of which perform different combos, but like calling this an action RPG is honestly kind of generous, especially if we're comparing it to other action RPGs like Kingdom Hearts, the Tales games, or Nier. In those games, each press of the button equals a swing of the weapon. Dodging requires manual activation, and the overall combat systems of these games feel responsive and snappy. It's the same with Final Fantasy VII Remake. In fact, talking about Remake, when they first gave a gameplay demonstration of that game, one thing they made incredibly clear was that one press of the attack button equals one swing of the Buster Sword, and I'd say this was likely because of the poor reception towards how 15's combat system works. There's some other stuff here like parrying by pressing circle after a block, blind sides, which are automatically activated special attacks when attacking an enemy from behind, technique attacks, which are manually activated team-ups that cost technique bars, warp striking at enemies to close the distance or to safety to restore MP, but really, there isn't any kind of true depth, technique, or skill to this system, as for the most part, it feels automated. Magic is also really disappointing here too. You collect either ice, fire, or thunder essence from magic nodes you'll find in the world, then craft magic by mixing these together with items or junk materials to pump out different results with limited uses. Magic doesn't even use MP here. Like, MP in this game is honestly kind of useless, as it's used exclusively for warp striking and dodging. But because every fight generally has a point warp spot that you can automatically warp to restore your MP, I never really found a need to like focus on increasing my MP to insane values. Items can be used as many times as you want during a combat situation, so there's no real sense of danger so long as you've got a shitload of high elixirs and Phoenix Downs. And don't even get me started on how awful this game's lock-on system is. To hard lock on, you have to press R1 and then click in the analog stick. There's no option to just make it so that lock on is always a hard lock on. And when you're surrounded by multiple enemies, you're trying to lock on to one specific enemy, it's the biggest like pain in the ass. Just also being surrounded by enemies in this game is just incredibly frustrating, getting attacked out of nowhere. You can't do anything but just hold down the square button and wait for them to stop spamming their attacks. God fucking damn it! At least Square eventually added an update that allows you to switch and play as your party members in the base game. This is really cool because honestly, all 3 of these guys feel better to play than Noctis. Ignis is super quick and his attacks often feel more responsive. Gladio is probably the best feeling, as it kinda seems like Square was wanting his gameplay to resemble that of a typical character action game, so his combat system feels very responsive, and Prompto is pretty much just a third-person shooter. By comparison, Noctis just feels a lot more sluggish and unresponsive compared to these 3. Noctis's final form mode, Armature, can be activated after dealing enough damage and filling the circle gauge. It allows him to quickly zip from enemy to enemy, phasing in and out, attacking at high speeds with multiple weapons, and that sounds really cool, but in actuality, you're simply just holding down the attack button and waiting for the gauge to deplete. I don't even think you can die in this mode. I haven't tried it out. I think the mode stops you from dying, like you can get to 1 HP, but like you can't actually go into danger mode. But hey, at least it looks cool. I do feel like I'm being a tad harsh. This combat system isn't completely awful, it's just okay at best, and it's fine enough for me to play 80 plus hours of it. But the game was originally meant to feature a system that was more akin and reactive to something like Kingdom Hearts 2, which kills me to know. Like I was saying, Versus 13 originally featured a command menu, with it being laid out almost identically to a Kingdom Hearts game, with what looks like more reactive action combat, a stronger focus on aerial combos and maneuverability, along with character switching from the get-go. The last build of this combat system that we got to see was in June of 2013, a few months before Tabata would take over and change it to the active cross battle system we ended up getting in 15. In this footage, you can see Nomura and the team cut away with the heavily reminiscent KH command menu and opted for something a little bit more clean cut. But you'll notice every time Noctis attacks, the attack section of the UI is being spam pressed, indicating that each press of the attack button is one swing. Also, the dodge system looks more functional, and comboing between weapons was apparently a thing. Hell, we could even switch between 5 different weapons rather than 4, so I imagine that there would have been a great emphasis on stringing together unique combos via weapon switching. Like I said, you end up enjoying Final Fantasy XV a lot more when you try not to think about what the game originally was, especially with Versus 13, but admittedly, it's hard not to think about specifically the combat system, just because the combat system that we received in 15 feels like the biggest downgrade of all. The plus that I can say about 15 though in the gameplay department is that it is undoubtedly more of an RPG than Final Fantasy 16. 16 focused hard on its combat system, being more akin to something like Devil May Cry, a character action hack and slash game, which is fine because the combat system in 16 is god tier. It is fucking awesome, but the focus was so strong on that combat system that as a result, Square Enix ended up ditching most of the RPG DNA for that game. 15 still retains some of it. I won't go as far as to say that there is insane build diversity and freedom for the player to decide how exactly they want to set up their party members as well as Noctis. But you are definitely given RPG options here. We've got gear that is either in the form of accessories or your current outfit, tons of different weapons throughout the game, all of which have different stats and additional bonuses. The Ascension skill tree, which AP can be spent on. This is where you'll unlock new active effects for combat or of course passives, new technique team-up attacks with your party members, additional passives for exploration. I think the Ascension board is fine, but I will say that some of the AP costs for some of the nodes here are ridiculous. 333 AP, are you kidding me? 999? There are nodes that you can unlock that allow you to gain more AP from doing general things, but still, you don't really gain AP all that fast. So some of the costs here are a little bit questionable. Between the food system, the importance of Gil in this game with shopping, dialogue choices, and just the general way that the game flows is definitely more RPG rooted than Final Fantasy 16. Don't get me wrong, I loved 16, and it does quite a few things a lot better than 15 does. But I think it is important when looking at Final Fantasy 17 for Square Enix to go back to their hard RPG roots, whether that does mean remaining with action RPG, offering a combat system maybe similar to the Final Fantasy VII Remake games, or just returning to turn-based. Either way, I think that a mainline Final Fantasy game always needs to have strong RPG elements. Now, visually speaking, 15 is kind of incredible. This was the very first game that Square Enix developed on their in-house engine, Luminos engine, which acted as a great demonstration of what this brand new shiny engine was capable of. Even though years later, Square Enix will go ahead to develop only one more game on it and then ultimately ditch it for Unreal Engine. But even by today's standards, the game still holds up incredibly well. Sure, there are moments where 15 can look a little bit washed out, muddy, and not great, but honestly, more so than not, this is a pretty visually stunning game, especially if you are playing the PC version of the game where you get the additional little eye candy features. On top of that too, there is also an official 4K texture pack that makes the game look even better. Because Versus and 15 was focusing on a fantasy based on reality, means that for the visuals here, Square Enix were focusing heavily on photorealism. Realistic looking environments and foliage, character models, enemies, clothing, the works. Also, for some reason, 15 has really impressive looking hair visuals, whether it be the visuals themselves, the physics, or how light interacts with hair in the game. This game actually ended up using NVIDIA Hairworks, which is sort of a redundant technology at this point, as hair or cloth physics are now all inbuilt as a technology into something like Unreal Engine, and does look admittedly more impressive than what's going on here in 15, but at the time, this was incredibly impressive, and like I'm saying, it still holds up to this day. The game also used an impressive grass technology known as NVIDIA Turf Effects as well, to simulate better grass physics, along with allowing all of the grass in the game to be proper 3D blades of grass rather than your typical 2D blades. A lot of these additional eye candy features can only be found on the PC version, but because of them, helps the game age very well. Because 15's world is focusing more on realism, so that all environments are more grounded in reality than fantasy, it means that we miss out on the typical Final Fantasy themed environments. But that being said, this game's environment and its world still looks incredibly beautiful. Definitely not as good looking as something like Final Fantasy VII Remake or Rebirth, but it does get very close, and that's impressive considering that this is a 2016 video game. The final thing I want to touch on here is the DLC and additional content. Final Fantasy XV received a ton of additional content, whether it be small collaboration events, additional items that were added into the game, the Royal Edition, new content that expanded on parts, or of course the DLC episodes. Square Enix did support 15 for quite some time, and the original plan was to support it for even longer beyond what we got, receiving the final DLC episode in 2019, just under 3 years after the game had released. Now, I'm not going to do a deep dive on the DLC episodes, as I want to do that in a separate video. Also, I'm still yet to even play episode Arden, but I do understand that this DLC dived a little bit more into Arden's backstory, which was appreciated, allowed us to actually play as the man with some cool new systems, and finally giving us daytime insomnia. But at least looking at Prompto, Gladio, and Ignis's DLCs, these sort of fill in the gaps for when these characters are absent throughout the main game's story. They helped flesh out these characters a little bit more so, with the core focus being on just primarily that character. I think out of these three, Ignis is 100% the absolute best. Not just because his gameplay is awesome, but also the story, focusing on what he was doing during Old Tish's invasion, along with finding out how he became blind. I really enjoyed all three of the DLC episodes here. They offer new gameplay experiences, and of course the additional story that they add is nice, but you are left wondering, why was this just not in the base game from the very get-go, considering that their stories take place during gaps? This ultimately comes back to the whole time issue thing. I'm sure that if Square Enix had more time, they probably would have been in the game without needing to be DLC episodes. The most annoying part about 15's DLC though is the cancelled episodes. A little while after the release of the first three, Square Enix announced 4 new major DLCs, episodes that revolve around Arden, Luna, Aranea, and Noctis. We did end up getting Arden, but Square Enix stepped forward to announce that any future plans for more DLC and the currently planned ones has been cancelled, with Hajime Tabata stepping away from Square Enix. Fans were rightfully outraged about this, due to Aranea expanding more on her character, and Luna and Noctis' stories focusing more on an alternate ending to that of 15, which at the time a lot of people were excited to experience and were hoping to consider the true final canonical ending of 15 for those that weren't satisfied with the originals. But Square Enix didn't leave fans totally hanging, as some of the story stuff that was planned to be in these DLC episodes was turned into a novel called Dawn of the Future. Still, a lot of people were not happy about this and wanted to experience what the DLCs had to offer. It's kind of crazy when you consider the rocky start of Versus XIII and the development hell it was going through, and then look towards the end of 15's life cycle with the other additional content that was cancelled. The entire existence of 15 has really been sticky and muddy from start to finish. The Royal Edition update of the game did provide some brand new content to add into the base game, which honestly was appreciated. For starters, Square Enix expanded upon the Insomnia City Ruins map, as originally it was quite small, and this was one of the major complaints coming from fans at the time, as for many years they had been promised in Insomnia that they could properly explore. This expanded map is still really not quite that, though it is cool to know that this chapter is a little bit more substantial with the Ruins expansion. Multiple new boss fights were added into Insomnia. Cerberus, who is part of the story progression, is fought just outside the gates of the Citadel. 4 extra bosses were added once you get inside the Citadel, all of which are spirits of former Lucis queens and kings. I also love how these fights directly involve you switching to either Ignis, Prompto, or Gladio, depending on which one you're facing, in order to finish them off. And the final one here is Omega, a brand new super boss acting as the hardest challenge in the game. The additional boss content here was really great and made the chapter feel just a little bit more substantial. Weirdly enough, this update also added the Royal Vessel as a drivable vehicle, so you can now take the boat out into the open oceans of nothingness. There's nothing really out here other than a ton of fishing spots. This is really more so meant to be an expansion on fishing. There's a quest that's attached to this that allows you to catch a fucking whale. So yeah, there's a fishing boss now. But otherwise, this is really just for the fishing enthusiast. It's not like there's some secret islands located out in the ocean that you can go and explore. It really is just a vast ocean of nothing but fish. And that's totally okay if you're into the fishing minigame of 15. There was also some other smaller stuff like the character switching, some brand new cutscenes, new items, a stronger version of Armature known as Armature Unleashed, and even a first-person camera mode. The Royal Edition update, while aspects of it were a little bit disappointing, like the expansion to Insomnia, as it just simply wasn't really what people were wanting out of Insomnia, overall, this additional content was fantastic, considering that by this point, Square Enix had already released so much extra stuff. When you take into account just the base game of 15, along with the DLC, and then the extra other goodies that Square Enix threw in, there is so much video game here. The fact that you can find Final Fantasy 15 for dirt cheap nowadays is one of the best values in gaming. So to conclude, I feel the same way about 15. Perhaps maybe the appreciation though has grown a little bit fonder with going back through the game recently. It certainly does have its issues, and it's painful knowing about its long history. But taking the game at face value, with everything that the game actually does offer, for me it's one of the more enjoyable Square Enix experiences. I think the game has aged particularly well over this past decade. It's still a ton of fun to go back to and re-experience. I don't think that this game is neither a masterpiece or a mistake. It sits somewhere comfortably right in the middle. It's certainly not the best thing that Square Enix has ever pushed out, but it's absolutely not the worst either. What I can say for absolute certain is this is just hands down like the best road trip RPG I think I've ever played. Let's just take Final Fantasy out of the title for like 1 minute. This, just as a road trip video game thing with fantasy and realism elements mixed into one another, is fucking awesome. I honestly have to take my hat off to Hajime Tabata though. I know that during the release of 15, this guy caught a lot of flack. And whether or not Tabata truly left Square Enix due to the development of 15 and its eventual reception really is all just speculation. I think this guy purely just wanted to go out on his own and start up his own new studio. But the fact that this guy walked into such a half-baked mess, having to deal with so many development issues, puzzles, and to figure it all out in such a short amount of time is honestly pretty admirable. Sure, it's really easy to just point the finger at Tabata and blame him and his direction for the game that we ended up receiving compared to the game that was initially advertised. But I think that people have to keep in mind the hurdles that both him and the team had to get over in order to ensure that this game would cross the finish line. The higher ups at Square Enix easily could have looked at Versus XIII and decided to just completely can the entire project altogether. I think that people should be thankful that at the very least we got some type of version of this game. Thank you so much for tuning into today's video. Drop your thoughts and opinions about Final Fantasy XV and Versus XIII in the comment section down below. Be sure to slippity slap that like button, it helps me out more than you know, and subscribe to the channel to keep up with everything going on here. A big shout out to my wonderful patrons and YouTube members. I hope you guys are having a fantastic day, and we'll chat again real soon.